many of you, I suspect it's review. For others, it's perhaps too much too quickly. It's always hard to know how to pitch that. All right. The purpose of this next little session, the thought was to treat it as an open problems question, as an open problem for this group. There's another interpretation of open problems, which is like, what has the field not solved yet? And I have a couple of those where I think the research can go next. And I'm happy to do either, but I guess I would prefer to start with people sort of opening questions and saying where they're at. So Allison, I see your hands up. Let's start there.
Hi, so I have a, I guess when you're doing I'm thinking about like strong and weak ties. And when you do the name generator, I feel like you come up with more of the strong ties, but I feel like there's research showing that weak ties could be important in like getting new information. So when you're collecting data, how do you get at those people that, like your neighbor, those less close people, but who could be important at giving you information?
Yeah, that's a great question, and we should ask Jimmy when he gets back on again, if he's not here yet, Jimmy Adams, because I think he touches on it in his new data collection book. But my general intuition is the best way to get a weak ties is to think about these kinds of overlapping activities and say, who do you spend time with at certain things? So, for example, you might ask, where do you go shopping? What kind of movies do you go to? Where do you go to the movies? These kinds of things. To get a sense of not a particular person, but the kind of person a person is connected to. And so that's one way to do it. The other way to do it is to really just to ask for weak ties. And so you can do that. You can say, who are the people that you interact with infrequently? The problem is that almost definitionally they don't know their names, right? So if you really want weak ties, those tend to be friends of a friend or acquaintances, and those tend to be people that you recognize, you bump into them, you might have seen them on an email chain, something like this, but you don't interact with them frequently. And so this is why I think that context connections, like going to seminars together or these kinds of things, having cited the same work or something, depending on your context, is the sort of question that I would probably go for. The other way to do that, there's an entire literature on these things called social capital generators, and then they're related to these things called network scale-up generators. But there, what you do is you ask people how many X's do they know. So how many doctors do you know? How many lawyers do you know? How many janitors do you know? And so you have some array of types of people where the type is defined by whatever is relevant for your research question. And then you ask people about their connections to those types of people, and that then gives you an array of the kinds of weak ties they have. I think, and then so the original version of that was done in the context of social capital and bringing in social resources, excuse me. And so that's why it tended to focus on socioeconomic differences across the SES scale of occupation. But there's been a lot of work recently done there's a lot of thinking about this. Lu-Jin Song at Vanderbilt has done a fair amount of this work in the health context, and there you ask people about health typical alters, so doctors or people who smoke, or you can think about categories of people that are health relevant directly, and then just literally ask about how many people in your network smoke, and just have people think about this themselves. So I think that's another way to get at the kinds of things that weak ties get you. Does that help? Does other people have other ideas for this? Another way to do it, which is it does happen with some of the network sampling with memory or other RDS kinds of studies, is to ask people who else they know, right? So if you ask people their strong ties, and then if you're able to get to those people, you can ask them, well, who are the people that they hang out with that aren't in your network? And the people who are 2 steps away from me but not in my network are my weak ties, usually. And people, I'm usually aware of them. I know they exist, but I don't interact with them. So either they're people I dislike, so I'm actively avoiding them, or they're just below my threshold of people that I'm close to. But that's a great question. from an Eagle Network standpoint, Claude Fisher's book, To Dwell Among Friends, and the most recent sort of iteration of that project, which is the, I'm going to forget the acronym, but it's the UC something study by Claude Fisher. And they have a whole series of something like 50 or 60 name generators that they asked. And part of it was this attempt to get at weak ties. And so if you really want to do it well, you got to be willing to do that kind of an investment to collect that time. And like, I don't know what they paid their respondents with. You know, here it would have to be tickets to a Duke basketball game or something. It's like, it's got to be something that you just can't get to get people to sit there that long, but they did it. Great question. Other questions or thoughts about things that are interesting or important or you're just curious about? I could pick people randomly and just have you tell me what your main problem is.
This isn't a problem so much, but I am interested in your thoughts on where you think the field is going. I have thoughts myself, but I'm really curious to know what you think.
Yeah, it's, I think that, I mean, you know, we can spend hours at this, but I think that there are that there's been something of a split since in what I would call like a three-way split in the field since about, you know, the mid 2000s and you know, like 2005 2006 or so. On the one hand, you've got the network science folks coming out of physics and statistical physics. On the other hand, you have the statistical modeling of networks, and then on the other hand, you have sort of a re-emergence of ego networks. And I think those have been the three main growth areas sort of that have spun off from the traditional large-scale multiple networks, ad health style sort of research tradition. And so in many ways, all three of those are solutions to problems that we only saw when we had multiple networks in the same kind of setting. But on the one hand, the statistical physics model is fundamentally interested in universal features of networks as systems. And they don't really care if it's a network of automobiles, a network of people, or a network of, you know, particles in, you know, a magnetic field, right? So it's, in that sense, it really is, you know, features that have to do with the properties of large scale graphs, and large scale is usually on the order of millions, if not the order of billions. There are social versions of that, and those tend to be things like the you know, COVID diffusion models that are large field approximations to the global networks, or things like Michael Macy has some work, for example, on telephone networks in all of England, for example. So I think there's that branch of work. It's rich. It's going to keep going. I have some serious doubts about it in terms of its applicability to real social network questions at sort of the social behavioral scale, in the sense that, and I'm happy to talk about those, but I'll come back to that in a second. The other model, sort of the middle screen, is this model of statistical modeling of network. This has been an attempt to overcome some of the statistical limitations of traditional network analysis. Traditional network analysis that started in the 70s and moved through the mid 90s was fundamentally a case study exercise. You go to one setting, you collect data in that setting, and you describe that setting in detail. The beauty of that is sort of the ethnographic richness that comes with any kind of case study. And the cost of that is you end up with one observation, right? And so one single thing. And so you do all this work and you get an N of one. And so people are like, well, what do we do with this? Let's get, and so that branches out then to the multiple networks, and that gets you ad health, it gets you Prosper, it gets you, you know, the kind of stuff that Chrisakis and Minogue are doing, right? So you get all these different sort of lots of village studies. And the thinking there is, well, if one case study is good, 180 case studies are better. But it's really hard to do 180 case studies, so you need some summary tool. And so that's given rise to this whole sort of series of questions about modeling networks. And the original thinking of this, I think, really was a way to try to build in a case study ethnographic understanding in a, you know, a generalizable, easy to apply way. And so if you think about what an ergom is really a way of the exponential random graph model. For the people who haven't heard this yet, it's typically known as an ergom. Those models really are attempting to say, to answer the kinds of questions that ethnographers would ask is, why does the network look the way it does? Like, where does structure come from? And what these models do is try to operationalize that as saying networks are constellations of emergent properties that come from micro situations that people are embedded in. And so if we can do that, put them together, slap a little bit of randomness to it, you might get something that explains where a network comes from. So that's the thinking behind it, if you will, at a really, really high level. And what that did is it opened this entire floodgate, thinking about networks as statistical objects of, and problems for statisticians to solve. That is, networks become an inference problem as opposed to an explanation problem. And that's opened up questions about thinking about networks as being embedded in latent space models and being embedded in simultaneous influence process and flow process, this whole sort of series of statistical architecture layered on top of networks. The beauty of that work is that it really has succeeded, I think, beyond anyone's original dreams in terms of where it's gone. So now the rich field of statistical modeling of networks is a field unto itself. I think a little bit of the original ethnographic sort of, where does structure come from impetus for that has gotten subsumed under what I think are somewhat more trivial questions about causality that are a bit more like probably people being clever than people being truly interested in the problem. But in any event, I think that direction is also going on and doing well. And then I think in really just the last 5 or 6 years, people have recognized all the value that comes out of ad health and Prosper and the other kinds of big multi-network studies, and said, well, what can we get out of that we can also get at the national level? And they've rediscovered ego networks, and part of that came from the statistical modeling approach. Is that once you understand that a lot of what generates large-scale big networks are how people act and react to the configurations around their local network, means you can collect data in the local network and say some pretty clear things about the global network that each of those local networks are embedded in. So Jeff Smith had a really nice paper showing how you can simulate global networks from ego networks. Martina Morris and Pavel Kavinsky had another nice piece that looked at simulated networks from an ergom framework using ego networks. And then Mario Small and Bernice Pescasolido and Bria Perry have this wonderful book come out here just last year, re-understanding where ego networks come from and how we think about ego network data and the things you can get from them. And what's the intersection of that statistical modeling set with the ego network set essentially gets you at a lot of the social context that generates networks. Now, it doesn't let you map the fusion, it doesn't let you see sort of large divisions, but it does get at things like homophily, peer influence, and things like this in a pretty reasonable way. And you can get a nationally representative sample if you want one. And so that's the advantage of those kinds of models. So I think from my standpoint, I think those are the three big threads that have gone on. The pieces that I would like to see come back to are to take the things we've learned from those three branches and put it back into the core that's kind of been left hollow, to think about these big places like the Honduras study or the Indian villages study or other kinds of places where you have big, rich, multiple networks, and you can think about using these tools in a smart way to characterize those networks. I think that a lot of those kinds of case study intuitions just need to be revived, particularly on the role and position analysis side. That's Moody's vision of the world from 10,000 feet. I don't know if it's a fair one, but that's the way I see it. Someone should jump in and tell me I'm a fool. Other questions on this? So I did have a few, like I said, just quick things I could share in terms of these kinds of sort of network frontier problems. Maybe I'll just sort of pop, hearing none, open it up again. All right, I might just do a quick hit on this, then why not?
Jim, when you were talking about the Perry, Smalls, and Pescasolido book, is it the edited volume? I'm trying to find.
Yes, exactly. And what's great about that book is that they start, so it really is probably, it's going to become, I think, if it isn't already, the it is to Wasserman and Faust. It's what Wasserman and Faust is to global networks, to local networks. And what's nice about it is they start with some classics, some very original like stuff published in the 50s and 60s, and some even earlier, and then get contemporary people to comment on it, and then they sort of spin off into where current local network analysis is at. So it's a really great book for understanding local networks, and it does, I think, a really good job of saying that, again, if your interest in networks is understanding the social context in the same way that we understand, geographic context, if you want to think about networks as context with which individuals are embedded in, then local networks are an incredibly rich way to get that information. That's not all of networks, but it's a good chunk of it. And it turns out that once you understand it, especially if you're able to collect high quality economic data, you can make some pretty good inferences about the global network because of all the good work that's happened in the inferential statistics side of network analysis. Does that answer the question? I forgot what the question was, so I'm not sure if I answered it. This is the problem with you get me talking once I go. But so if I was going to throw up a couple of quick points that I think are sort of frontier elements that are worth thinking about for those of you, the young people in the room who are looking for something to write a career on. So in addition to those sort of three sort of chunks that have occurred, I think there are some interesting data issues and sort of analysis problems that I'm going to just give you sort of my top three that are worth thinking about, I think. The first one is that we now have a lot of network data. And I think that one of the things that is hard to appreciate is that this is a slide that I pulled out from a project I was involved in using GitHub as a data source, looking at how people share across the different GitHub domains. And in that particular case, the overall network was millions of nodes. And so this little thing that looks like a dozen nodes in front of you, that represents 53,000 nodes just there in that image. It could, because each of the nodes there is itself a cluster of networks that range in size from a handful up to almost 10,000 nodes. So one of the things that we have now is a lot of network data, particularly from online or other kinds of electronic trace data. And I think that on the one hand, we can just seed that to the statistical physicists and say, go and have fun with it, or run a machine learning algorithm on it and knock yourself out. But I think that that if computational social science has anything to add to the field of this work, it's that we should be able to take some of the insights we have from smaller studies and use that to think about the way these structures work. And then just to throw it out in this particular example, if you take a role understanding of what these networks look like, what you realize is you have a network of networks, and each of those networks that are really well thought of as communities, and the modularity on this thing was 0.98, right? So it's like this is a heavily modular network. And it's because it's built on computer languages and particular problems within computer languages. So if you're in the Python cluster, then you're in Python, you're in something else. So it ends up that these things tend to be very localized. But they tend to have two fundamental different structure types. One is a core periphery structure, and another is what I would call a segmented social structure. And the kinds of behaviors that occur in a core periphery structure are characteristic of dictatorships worldwide. Now, GitHub is not a dictatorship, but when you have a central hub that's sending out repos to the periphery, that sends out repos to the periphery, it has the same analogical feel as a dictatorship. Whereas if you have a segmented society, that's something else entirely, right? So if you can think about these different kinds of structures as mapping on to things that we really know, that the thing that we think of as a giant node of a billion node, a giant network of a billion nodes, it's really not. It's really tends to be an aggregation of lots of smaller networks. And the smaller networks are things that sociologists and social health researchers are good at getting their head around. The thing that I think for the health research, the health side of this, and I don't have the slide with me because I've done some of this work before, are patient sharing networks. So we have thought of, I think that if anybody wants a great dissertation, in the social networks and health field, understanding the actual network of patients through physicians and the way that physicians are connected to each other is a really rich field that is yet to be fully plumbed. And if you look at just Medicare records, and Medicare is a thin slice of all of the health provision that occurs in America, it's a fully connected network. That is, if you have a physician in Miami, Florida, I guarantee you I can get you to a physician in Seattle through less than 3 patients. And it's just the way this network is connected, because Americans are a highly mobile population, and physicians share patients across these mobile settings all the time, and different specialties ship people around. And so the entire connected set of networks in America is really incredible. And I think that there's a lot of work to be done on that. So from a social network and health standpoint, you can take this insight and say, let's look at this big, rich global data in a way that really is one hospital or one clinic or one community or one type of patient, and how are they connected to each other. And I think that you would learn something in ways that we don't currently learn. The other sort of problem that I think is wide and open and ready to go is what I would refer to as the flip side of the going big, which is going deep. We have a lot of big data now being generated electronically on single people, right? So if you imagine that little thing you're carrying around in your phone every day, it's counting your number of steps, it's counting your heartbeat, it's counting like all of these health information that you get in real time across many, many days. And so you can get millions of data points on a single person. But to what end? Like, what does it mean? What do we do with it? And so I think there's a lot of this notion of thinking about the electronic traces of data on individuals or small groups of people allow us to think about sort of what a social life, sort of the social network research literature and foundation was built on what Wasserman and Faust referred to originally as stable relations. And so you really try to figure out what the relationship was between a person and another person. And that's what the network was. The network, by virtue of calling it structured, was something that was reasonably stable. What contributed to relationships were interactions. And so you might talk to one person you don't really have a relationship to, that's a weak tie or what have you, but the relationships are repeated interactions. What these electronic traces allow us to do is to get at the interaction network directly and sidestep the relationship. So we can ask, what is all the interactions that people have over a course of a month? That gives you this deep insight into their sort of relational behavior. And some of those things are going to be disease relevant, some of them are going to be mental health relevant, some of them are going to be general support relevant. But understanding that kind of day-to-day, moment-to-moment activities on the space that people are embedded in, I think is sort of the next frontier for sort of the deep side of social network analysis. And then finally, I think that there's lots of work to be done on taking these data sets that we've now collected and doing what I would refer to as comparative network analysis. So now we have AdHealth, we have Proper, we have Honduran villages, we have the Indian villages set. These data sets allow us to ask questions about the comparative statics of networks in ways that we just couldn't do before, because all we ever had was one single site. So I think that hopefully people will keep investing in these kinds of data, and we'll hopefully keep getting more of them. Now I can go through lots of other sort of versions of these, but those would be my big 3 sort of areas that I think we should sort of push down and keep working on. Questions, comments, thoughts, concerns? All right, maybe we will shift gears then and jump over to ego network analysis. Is that good for folks? Yes, all right. We've decided we're going to try to keep the recordings matching the session, so I'm going to stop the recording and restart it so that we have it set up that way.